Okay, so get ready, because today we are going deep, really deep into the dark world of Charles Manson.
One of the most notorious figures in American history.
Definitely. And it's interesting, you've sent over a ton of material on Manson.
A really in-depth academic paper that breaks down his psychology.
Plus, like, a mountain of news articles and historical accounts.
Yeah, we've got a lot to unpack.
We do, but our mission today isn't just to rehash the gruesome details of the Tate LaBianca murders.
Right.
We really want to go beyond that, beyond the headlines.
And try to understand what made this man tick.
Yeah, like, how did he gain such a devoted following? Why does his name still, I don't know, give people chills even today, decades later?
It's a question that has captivated people for a long time. And you know what's interesting is that Manson, he wasn't some shadowy figure, right? He craved the spotlight. He saw himself as a star.
Oh, totally, like a twisted rock star leading his band of followers towards total chaos. So let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about his early life, which, honestly, it's a pretty rough ride from day one.
It is, 1934. He's born to a 15-year-old runaway who was already involved in prostitution.
Oh, wow.
His childhood was just, marked by neglect and instability.
Yeah.
And there's this anecdote. It's a hard one to hear, but I think it really sets the stage.
Okay.
His mother reportedly traded him for a pitcher of beer
What?
to a cocktail waitress. Just, to illustrate the abandonment he faced from the very beginning.
Wow. That's just heartbreaking. It's really hard to imagine the impact that kind of rejection would have on a child, especially that young.
And that feeling of rejection, the lack of that family connection, it becomes a recurring theme throughout his life. It kind of fuels his desire to create his own family. But as we know, that family becomes something pretty sinister.
Yeah, it's like this twisted mirror image of a family, right? Where instead of love and support, there's manipulation and control. And it's interesting how music, something that usually brings people together, becomes a tool for Manson's manipulation.
Yes.
I mean, he was drawn to music from a young age.
He was, yeah. He'd spend hours playing piano. He even started writing his own songs, piecing together verses from popular tunes and hymns.
Wow.
And I think he understood the power of music, that emotional power, and later he'd use it to attract followers and to solidify their loyalty.
Yeah, it's almost like he recognized that shared experience of music, it could create a sense of belonging, a sense of community, which is exactly what he offered these lost souls he drew into his circle.
Exactly, yeah. But there were signs, even in his childhood, of the manipulator he would become.
Really?
Oh, yeah. In school, he was already figuring out how to get his classmates to do his bidding, even orchestrating attacks on other students.
That's pretty chilling.
Oh, yeah. And when he was confronted, he'd feign innocence, claiming he had no control over their actions.
It's like a preview of how he'd later operate with his family. Like, he'd plant ideas, he'd encourage them to act, but never give direct orders.
Right.
Always maintaining that level of plausible deniability.
A classic tactic of manipulators.
Yeah. And then there's the incident with the sickle. This is when he was just 7 years old.
Yeah.
He threatened his cousin with it, and thankfully she escaped unharmed, but it's a glimpse into that violence that was already brewing.
Yeah. That darkness was already there.
And this is all before he even hits his teenage years, right?
Right. And sadly, his adolescent years were a downward spiral into delinquency and institutionalization.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was sent to a school for wayward children, but he kept running away, stealing, landing in, increasingly stricter facilities. He was exposed to a brutal subculture of violence and abuse.
Yeah.
Both as a victim and a perpetrator.
So it's almost like he was trapped in this cycle of crime and punishment, with each experience kind of further hardening him against society.
Yeah, and despite a few brief moments where it seemed like he might turn his life around, a marriage, a child, he always ended up back in prison.
Really?
Yeah. And it was during one of these stints, in the early 60s, that he really started to develop his warped worldview, drawing inspiration from sources like Scientology and the writings of Hitler.
It seems like he was constantly searching for something to believe in, some grand narrative that would give him a sense of purpose.
Oh, he was. And that's what makes his release in 1967 so pivotal. He finds himself in San Francisco, the heart of the counterculture movement.
Yeah, a time of social and political upheaval.
Exactly, the perfect breeding ground for his twisted vision to take root.
Yeah, I mean, the late 60s were this time of disillusionment with authority, this yearning for something new, something different. And Manson, he tapped into that yearning, but he twisted it to fit his own agenda.
He was a master at reading people. identifying their vulnerabilities and exploiting them.
And he preyed on the lost and the lonely.
He did, offering them a sense of belonging, a purpose, a family.
Yeah, but he was incredibly charismatic, though, wasn't he? I mean, he had this almost hypnotic hold over his followers.
He did. He used music, drugs, this carefully crafted persona to create an aura of mystery and power. His followers truly believed he was a prophet, a visionary.
Wow, yeah. And this brings us to Helter Skelter, that apocalyptic race war that he envisioned,
Right.
which he took from the Beatles song, of course.
He did, twisting its meaning to fit his own warped worldview.
Yeah, it's a chilling example of how he'd take something familiar, something popular even, and distort it into something very sinister.
And it's important to note, he never explicitly ordered the murders. He planted the seeds, encouraged his followers to act on their own, making them believe they were in control.
It was all about manipulation, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
He knew how to push their buttons, how to exploit their desire for acceptance and their fear of rejection.
Precisely.
And that brings us to the horrific events that would forever cement Charles Manson's place in history.
Yeah.
The Tate LaBianca murders.
Yeah.
These weren't just random acts of violence. They were meticulously planned and orchestrated to achieve a specific goal, to incite that race war that Manson believed was inevitable.
The details are incredibly disturbing.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to understand the level of calculated cruelty involved.
Yeah.
The way these murders were designed to shock and terrorize, not just the victims, but society as a whole.
Absolutely. So it's August of 1969, 4 of Manson's followers, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Charles Tex Watson, and Linda Kasabian. They arrive at the Cielo Drive home of actress Sharon Tate and her husband, director Roman Polanski.
Right.
And their first act is to cut the phone lines, isolating the house, cutting off any chance of escape.
Creating a scene of inescapable terror.
Yeah. Inside the house, they encounter Wojciech Frykowski, a screenwriter, and Abigail Folger, an heiress, along with Sharon Tate, who was, 8.5 months pregnant at the time.
Yeah, the fact that Sharon Tate was pregnant it makes this crime even more horrific.
Yeah.
It speaks to the complete lack of humanity.
Right. They tied up Tate and her friend, celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring, with rope. And when Sebring protests the treatment of Tate, Watson shoots him and then stabs him multiple times.
The level of violence was excessive, almost ritualistic.
Frykowski and Folger, they managed to escape the house briefly, but they were chased down and brutally murdered.
Yeah.
Folger was stabbed 28 times, and Frykowski was stabbed 51 times and shot multiple times.
It's almost impossible to fathom the sheer brutality of these attacks.
I know, it really is. And Tate, she pleaded for her life and for the life of her unborn child.
Yeah.
But her pleas were ignored.
Right.
Atkins and Watson stabbed her 16 times, and before leaving the scene, they used Tate's blood to write the word pig on the front door.
It was a chilling message intended to shock and terrify the public.
This act wasn't just about murder, it was about creating a spectacle, this horrifying display meant to incite chaos and fear. And tragically, the terror didn't end there.
It didn't.
The very next night, Manson himself led a group of followers to the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca.
Right.
Manson felt that the previous night's murders weren't terrifying enough.
Yeah.
So he wanted to show his followers how it's done.
This is a key point, Manson's direct involvement in the LaBianca murders. It reveals his true role in all of this.
Yeah.
He wasn't just some, passive observer spouting ideology. He was actively directing and participating in the carnage.
Wow, that's a truly disturbing realization.
Yeah.
So tell me more about what happened at the LaBianca residence.
So Lino LaBianca was stabbed multiple times, and the word war was carved into his stomach. Rosemary LaBianca was stabbed dozens of times. Manson wanted to make sure that each of his followers played a role in the killings.
God, the details are just horrific. It's hard to believe that this actually happened.
The Tate LaBianca murders sent shockwaves through Los Angeles, through the entire nation.
I can imagine.
People were terrified, gun sales skyrocketed, security measures were heightened.
Yeah.
This very real sense of fear gripped the city.
It's like something out of a nightmare. The idea that this kind of evil could be lurking right next door.
It shattered the illusion of peace and love that had defined the late 1960s.
Right.
Exposing this dark undercurrent of violence and extremism that many had chosen to ignore.
And Even more disturbing is the fact that many of Manson's followers remained fiercely loyal to him even after the truth of his crimes was revealed. I mean, they camped outside the courthouse during his trial.
It's a chilling testament to his enduring influence.
He really is.
This blind devotion, it speaks to the power of Manson's charisma and his ability to create a cult-like following.
Yeah.
He provided his followers with a sense of belonging, purpose, even a twisted sense of righteousness that allowed them to justify their actions. It's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming evidence, people can be incredibly resistant to changing their beliefs.
Right.
Especially when those beliefs are tied to a charismatic leader and a sense of community.
It's a sobering thought, and it makes you wonder how someone like Manson, someone with such a chaotic and destructive path, even ended up in a position to exert this much influence over others.
That's a question that's baffled experts for decades.
Mm.
And to really understand Manson, I think we need to dig deeper into his psyche.
Yeah.
Explore the psychological theories that might explain his actions.
Okay.
We need to try to make sense of the senseless. Welcome back. As we delve deeper into, this dark world of Charles Manson,
Yeah.
one of the most pressing questions we face is, what drove him to orchestrate these horrific acts?
Right, because it goes beyond just being a quote-unquote bad guy, right?
Oh, absolutely.
We're talking about acts that defy normal comprehension. And you mentioned we'd be looking into some psychological theories about Manson.
Yes.
So where do we even begin with that?
Well, you've given us some excellent resources here. The academic paper that you sent, it actually goes through the hair psychopathy checklist,
Okay.
which is a tool used by professionals to assess psychopathic traits.
Mm-hmm.
And Manson scored high on, a lot of these traits.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't psychologists, what exactly are we talking about here? What does the checklist tell us?
It's a list of 20 traits, and a high score suggests psychopathy, which is a serious personality disorder characterized by a lack of empathy, remorse, and disregard for social norms.
Uh-huh.
And Manson exhibited many of these traits, even from a young age.
So it wasn't just the 60s or the drugs or whatever else. This was something deeper within him.
It's complex, of course.
Yeah.
But many experts believe that his psychological makeup played a significant role in his actions.
Okay.
For example, he had a very grandiose sense of self. He truly believed he was a prophet, a messiah.
Right.
This inflated ego is a hallmark of narcissism, which often goes hand in hand with psychopathy.
Right, right. We talked earlier about how he wanted to be a star,
Exactly.
but instead of, the music world, it became this twisted stage of violence.
Exactly, yeah. And he was incredibly manipulative.
Uh-huh.
He had this knack for identifying people's vulnerabilities and exploiting them for his own gain. We weave these elaborate tales, twisting the truth to fit his narrative and control those around him.
And he never showed any remorse for his crimes, did he?
No, he never did. Even when faced with overwhelming evidence, he maintained this detached, almost emotionless demeanor.
Yeah.
He blamed society, the system, anyone but himself for the horrific crimes he orchestrated.
It's chilling. So based on all this, it seems like there's a strong case for Manson being a psychopath, right?
Seems so, yeah.
But I guess the big question is, how did someone like this, with such a disturbing personality, gain such a devoted following? I mean, these weren't just random strangers. These were people who lived with him, who believed in him.
That's the real puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it speaks to the power of charismatic leadership, especially when it preys on vulnerable individuals seeking acceptance and belonging.
Right.
Manson offered them a sense of family, of purpose,
Right.
in a world that often felt chaotic and meaningless.
He gave them something to believe in, even if that belief system was, completely twisted and dangerous.
Precisely. He tapped into the anxieties and uncertainties of the time, weaving this narrative of an impending apocalypse, a race war, which he called Helter, Skelter.
Right, right. And he used music and drugs and this, carefully crafted persona to draw them into his web of manipulation. It's almost like he created this alternate reality.
Yeah.
And his followers were completely absorbed into it.
Yeah, and within that reality, violence became, a twisted form of righteousness.
Oh, wow.
A necessary step towards achieving a greater good. It's a chilling thought, but it helps to explain how seemingly ordinary individuals could be persuaded to participate in such horrific acts.
It's a reminder that we all have vulnerabilities, right?
Yeah.
And those vulnerabilities can be exploited, especially by someone as skilled at manipulation as Charles Manson.
Absolutely, yeah. It's also a reminder of the importance of critical thinking, of questioning what we're told, especially when it comes from someone who claims to have all the answers.
Yeah. We've been focusing a lot on Manson himself, which is understandable, but I'm curious about his followers.
Yes.
What happened to them after the murders? What were their fates?
That's a great question. Some of them remained fiercely loyal to Manson, even behind bars.
Wow.
Others renounced their past and sought redemption.
Okay.
Susan Atkins, for example, who had initially bragged about the murders, later became a born-again Christian in prison
Okay.
and expressed, deep remorse for her actions.
So even within that group, there were different paths, different reactions to the enormity of what they'd done.
Absolutely, yeah. Patricia Krenwinkel, another key participant, has repeatedly expressed remorse and become an advocate for prison reform.
Okay.
Charles Tex Watson, who led the attacks, he also became a born-again Christian in prison and wrote several books about his experience.
Interesting. It's interesting to hear those varied responses,
Yeah.
It shows how the impact of this trauma wasn't uniform, even among those directly involved. But did any of them continue to follow Manson's ideology?
Some did, yeah. Leslie Van Houten, for instance, has consistently maintained her innocence, claiming she was brainwashed by Manson.
Wow.
Her case has been the subject of much debate, raising questions about coercion, free will, and the legal definition of insanity.
Yeah.
She remains incarcerated to this day.
So even decades later, the Manson family saga, it continues to cast this long shadow.
It does. And it's not just about the individuals involved. The Manson family murders, they had a profound impact on society as a whole.
Yeah.
They became a cultural watershed moment, marking the end of the 60s idealism
Right.
and ushering in this era of, fear and paranoia.
They shattered that illusion of peace and love that had defined the era.
Right.
It was like a wake-up call, this reminder that darkness could lurk even in the brightest of times.
Exactly, yeah. And the fascination with true crime, with trying to understand the minds of those who commit horrific acts, it really took hold after the Manson murders.
Yeah.
It was as if society was trying to grapple with this evil, to make sense of the senseless.
Yeah, it makes you think about how these events, as horrific as they were, really, really seeped into the cultural consciousness.
They did. And that's why we're still talking about Charles Manson today, even though he died in prison back in 2017.
Yeah.
His story continues to fascinate and horrify us,
Yeah.
forcing us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature.
It's a story that compels us to ask, these difficult questions.
Yeah.
About the nature of evil, the power of manipulation, and our own vulnerabilities as individuals and as a society.
And while the answers to those questions may be complex and elusive, the very act of asking them is crucial.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that we must be vigilant, that we must learn from the past,
Right.
so that we can protect ourselves and future generations from the darkness that Manson represented.
We've been on quite a journey, haven't we?
We have.
Unpacking the life and crimes of Charles Manson, digging into the psychology behind his manipulation and really examining the impact of his family's horrific acts.
Yeah, it's been a deep dive into some truly dark territory.
Yeah.
And as we wrap up, I think it's worth reflecting on what we can learn from all of this.
Right.
Because as much as Manson represents a specific time and place, those factors that allowed him to gain power, they're still relevant today.
That's what I keep coming back to. It's easy to just dismiss him as a monster, an anomaly.
Right.
But the more we understand about how he operated, the more we see those same patterns of manipulation, that same yearning for belonging, playing out in different ways in our own world.
Exactly. And one of the most striking takeaways, for me at least, is the power of charisma. Manson wasn't particularly intelligent or well-spoken.
Right.
But he had this uncanny ability to draw people in, to make them feel like they were part of something special.
Yeah, he tapped into that very human need for connection, for purpose, and he twisted it to his own advantage.
He did. And it's a reminder that we need to be critical thinkers.
Yeah.
To question authority, even when it's presented in a charming or alluring package.
Right.
We need to be wary of those who offer simple solutions to complex problems, who promise a sense of belonging at the expense of individual thought.
It makes you think about those too good to be true scenarios,
Yeah.
Whether it's a cult leader, a political figure, or even just someone you meet online, anyone who promises a quick fix or demands unquestioning loyalty, it should raise some red flags.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's important to recognize that manipulation often preys on vulnerability.
Yeah.
Manson targeted people who were lost, searching for meaning, disillusioned with society.
Right.
Those same vulnerabilities exist today. perhaps even more so in our increasingly isolated and uncertain world.
Which means, we have a responsibility,
Yes,
not just to protect ourselves, but to create a society that supports those who are struggling, that
yes,
fosters genuine connection and belonging.
absolutely.
Because if people have those needs met in healthy ways, they're less likely to fall prey to someone like Manson.
I couldn't agree more. We can't just focus on the darkness. We have to cultivate the light.
Right.
And part of that is remembering that even in the face of these horrific acts, there's always the possibility of redemption, of healing.
We talked about how some of Manson's followers found their own paths to atonement, to making amends for their past. It's a
Right.
reminder that even those who have committed terrible deeds are capable of change, of growth.
It's a message of hope amidst the
I agree.
darkness.
Yeah.
And it's also a reminder that we can't simply write people off,
Right.
even those who have done terrible things.
Yeah.
We need to believe in the possibility of rehabilitation, of second chances.
Because ultimately, isn't that what separates us from someone like Manson? That capacity for empathy, for remorse, for taking responsibility for our actions?
Precisely. And by fostering those qualities in ourselves and in our communities, we can, work to create a world where the darkness that Manson represented has less power to take root.
So, as we conclude this deep dive into the Manson family saga,
Yeah,
it's with a sense of both horror and hope.
I agree.
Horror at the depths of human depravity, but also hope for our capacity for growth, for change, for building a world where such tragedies are less likely to occur.
It's been a heavy but important conversation.
Mm.
And I think the biggest takeaway is this: knowledge is power.
Yeah.
By understanding the patterns of manipulation,
Uh-huh.
by recognizing the vulnerabilities that can be exploited,
Right.
we can empower ourselves and others to resist those forces and to build a more just and compassionate world.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Charles Manson.
Of course,
It's been a dark and winding journey,
it has.
but one that hopefully leaves us with a deeper understanding of the human psyche, both its potential for darkness and its capacity for light. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.